Before we begin, let us know where you're watching from. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Voices of Sister Liana for more dramatic stories. Vivian Johnson thought she knew everything about the man she married, until the day she went into labor and two identical versions of her husband walked into the delivery room. It was supposed to be the happiest day of her life. 9 months of waiting, planning, dreaming. She'd imagined this moment 1,000 times. William holding her hand, the first cry of their baby, the beginning of their family. But nothing could have prepared her for what actually happened. The contractions started at 3 a.m, sharp, relentless. Vivian gripped the edge of the bathroom sink, breathing through the pain. William was already awake, phone in hand, timing each wave. His face was calm, but his eyes were worried. They'd been through the classes, read the books, packed the hospital bag weeks ago. Everything was ready, except it wasn't. They lived in a quiet suburb of Portland, a neighborhood where everyone knew everyone. White picket fences, tree-lined streets, the kind of place where secrets didn't exist. Or so Vivian thought. William had moved there 5 years ago, right before they met. He never talked much about his past, said his family was complicated, that he'd grown up in foster care, that he didn't have anyone. Vivian never pushed. She had her own complicated history. She understood the need for fresh starts. The drive to the hospital was a blur. Rain hammered against the windshield. William's knuckles were white on the steering wheel. Vivian counted lampposts between contractions. Trying to focus on anything but the pain, trying not to think about all the things that could go wrong. She was 32. This was their first baby, their miracle baby after 2 miscarriages that had nearly broken them both. They checked in at 4:15. A nurse with kind eyes led them to a delivery room. Pale blue walls, monitors beeping, the smell of antiseptic and fear. William held her hand while the nurses hooked her up to machines. His touch was familiar, comforting. The same hands that had proposed to her on a beach in Cape Cod. The same hands that painted the nursery pale yellow last month. The same hands that had wiped her tears after each loss. But his face looked different, tense, almost scared. Vivian squeezed his fingers, told him it would be okay. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. And then he said something strange. He said he needed to make a phone call, that there was something he had to do. Vivian felt a flutter of panic that had nothing to do with labor. She asked who he needed to call at 4:30 a.m. William kissed her forehead, said it was just work, that he'd be right back. He was gone for 20 minutes. 20 minutes that felt like hours. Vivian labored alone with only the nurses checking in. The contractions were getting closer, harder. She wanted her husband, needed him. When he finally came back, his face was ashen. His hands were shaking. Vivian asked what was wrong. William opened his mouth to answer, and that's when the door opened again. Another man walked in, wearing the same jacket as William, the same height, the same build, the same face, exactly the same face. Vivian thought she was hallucinating, that the pain medication was making her see double. She blinked hard, but both men were still there, standing on opposite sides of her bed, looking at each other with an expression she couldn't read. Not quite anger, not quite fear. Something older, something buried. The nurse looked between them, confused, asked if this was the father. William started to speak, but the other man cut him off, said his name was Frank Johnson, that he was William's brother, his twin brother. Vivian felt the room tilt. William had told her he had no family, no siblings, no one. She'd built their entire life on that foundation, and now it was crumbling beneath her. Another contraction hit, harder than before. Vivian cried out, and both men reached for her at the same time, their hands identical, their movements mirrored. The nurse gently pushed Frank back, said only the father could stay. Frank didn't move. He looked at William with eyes full of something that might have been accusation, might have been grief. He said he had every right to be there, that William knew why. Vivian wanted to scream, wanted answers, but her body had other priorities. The doctor came in, said it was time to push. The room became a flurry of activity. William was at her side, his hand in hers, but his attention kept drifting to the door where Frank stood, watching, waiting, his face a mirror of the man Vivian had married. The pain became everything. Vivian pushed when they told her to push, breathed when they told her to breathe. Somewhere in the chaos, she heard William's voice, low and urgent, talking to Frank in a tone she'd never heard before, pleading, angry, desperate. She couldn't make out the words, just the emotion beneath them. Years of something unspoken, years of something wrong. And then there was a cry, high and perfect and new. Her daughter, their daughter. The nurse placed a tiny wailing bundle on Vivian's chest. She looked down at the most beautiful thing she'd ever seen. Dark hair plastered to a perfect little head, eyes squeezed shut, fingers curled into tiny fists. Vivian felt her heart break open in the best possible way. Felt love so fierce it hurt. She looked up to share the moment with William. But he wasn't looking at the baby. He was looking at Frank. And Frank was looking at the baby with an expression that made Vivian's blood run cold. Recognition, longing, and something else. Something that looked like ownership. The nurses took the baby to clean her up, check her vitals. William moved to follow, but Frank grabbed his arm, said they needed to talk. Right now. William tried to pull away, said it could wait. Frank's voice got louder, said it had already waited too long, that Vivian deserved to know the truth, that the baby deserved to know. Vivian's mind was fuzzy from exhaustion and medication, but those words cut through everything. She demanded to know what was happening, who Frank really was, why William had lied. The room went silent except for the beeping of monitors and the soft sounds of her newborn daughter being weighed and measured. William sat down heavily in the chair beside her bed, put his head in his hands, and started talking. His voice was broken, ashamed. He said he and Frank were identical twins, that they'd grown up together in foster care after their mother died when they were 6. That they'd been inseparable, two halves of the same person, until they turned 18. Frank took over the story. His voice was harder, more bitter. Said that William had gotten a scholarship to college, a way out, a chance at a different life. But there was only one scholarship, only one ticket to freedom. They'd both applied. William had won, and instead of sharing it or declining it, William had taken it, had left Frank behind in the system, had changed his last name, had disappeared. Vivian felt sick. William had told her he was an orphan, that he'd worked his way through college alone, scholarship, student loans, part-time jobs, all of it was true. But it wasn't the whole truth. He'd had a brother, an identical twin, and he'd abandoned him. William's voice cracked when he spoke again, said he'd tried to bring Frank with him. That he'd called, written letters, sent money when he had it. But Frank wouldn't forgive him, wouldn't speak to him. For 14 years, they'd been strangers. William said he'd tried to find Frank a dozen times, but Frank had disappeared into the system, into the streets, into a life that William couldn't save him from. Frank laughed, a sound without humor, said William had saved himself just fine, got his degree, got his job, got his perfect life in his perfect suburb with his perfect wife. While Frank had bounced between shelters and odd jobs and prisons for petty crimes that came from having nothing and no one. Said William had made himself into someone new, someone without a past, someone without a brother. Vivian felt tears streaming down her face. She'd thought she knew her husband, thought she understood his silences and his careful way of never talking about before. She'd called it trauma, called it self-protection, never imagined it was abandonment. She asked William when he'd planned to tell her, if he'd ever planned to tell her. William looked at her with eyes full of pain, said he didn't know, that he'd convinced himself the past was dead, that Frank was gone, that he could build a new life without ever looking back. But then 3 weeks ago, Frank had found him, had shown up at his office, had demanded to know why William had the right to happiness when Frank had nothing. Frank stepped closer to the bed. His face was softer now, almost gentle. He said he'd been angry for so long. Angry at William, angry at the world, angry at the mother who'd died and the system that had failed them both. But then he'd learned about the baby, about Vivian, about the family William was building, and something in him had shifted. He said he didn't come here to destroy anything. He came because he wanted to be part of something, to know his niece, to maybe rebuild what they'd lost. He said he'd been clean for 6 months, had a job at a warehouse, had an apartment, nothing fancy, but it was his. He was trying, finally trying. Vivian didn't know what to feel. Rage at William for lying, sympathy for Frank for suffering, fear about what this meant for their family, exhaustion from just giving birth to a daughter who was now connected to all of this pain and history. The nurse brought the baby back, wrapped in a pink blanket, fast asleep. Vivian took her daughter and felt the weight of her, the realness of her. This tiny person who had no idea about the complicated mess of the family she'd just been born into. Vivian looked at her daughter's face and saw William's nose, his chin. Features that were also Frank's nose, Frank's chin. Identical genetics, identical strangers. She asked Frank why he'd come today. Of all days, why show up in the delivery room? Frank's voice was quiet when he answered, said he'd been planning to wait, to give them time. But when William called him this morning, panicked and emotional, saying the baby was coming, something in Frank broke open. He couldn't stay away, couldn't let another moment pass where they were separated. He knew it was selfish, knew it was bad timing. But he'd missed 14 years. He couldn't miss this. William was crying now, really crying. He reached across Vivian and grabbed Frank's hand. Said he was sorry, over and over. Sorry for leaving, sorry for lying, sorry for building a life that didn't include the person he'd been built with. Frank gripped his hand back, both of them holding on like they were drowning. Vivian watched them. These two identical men with such different lives carved into their faces. William with his kind eyes and soft hands, Frank with his harder edges and scars, she was just beginning to see. But underneath it all, they were the same. Two halves that had been torn apart too young, two halves that were trying to figure out how to exist in the same space again. She made a decision, not because she wasn't angry, she was, not because she understood, she didn't, but because her daughter deserved more than secrets, more than abandonment, more than the kind of pain that had shaped both of these men. She asked Frank if he wanted to hold his niece. The words felt strange in her mouth, but right somehow. Frank looked at William looked at Vivian, and slowly, carefully, Vivian placed her newborn daughter into Frank's arms. He held her like she was made of glass, like she was the most precious thing he'd ever touched. Maybe she was. Tears ran down his face. He whispered something too quiet for anyone else to hear. But Vivian saw his lips move, saw him make a promise to this tiny baby, a promise to be better, to be present, to be the uncle she deserved. The hours that followed were strange, soft. William and Frank sat together while Vivian slept. When she woke up, she heard them talking, really talking for the first time in 14 years, about the mother they'd lost, about the foster homes, about the night William left, about the years of silence, about the anger and the guilt and the grief that had lived between them like a third person. Frank told William about the years after, the bad choices, the worse consequences, the slow climb back to something resembling okay. William told Frank about the nightmares, the therapy, the constant fear that he didn't deserve happiness because he'd bought it with Frank's suffering. They cried, they argued, they laughed at shared memories that no one else would understand. They started to stitch together the pieces of what they'd once been. Vivian listened from the bed. Her body was exhausted, but her mind was racing. She thought about the wedding vows she'd made to William. For better or worse, she'd meant them. But she'd never imagined worse would look like this. A secret brother, a hidden past. A foundation built on half-truths. But she also thought about the baby sleeping in the bassinet beside her. Her daughter, who would grow up knowing her father had a twin, who would have an uncle, who would never have to wonder about the missing pieces of her history because they were right here. Complicated, messy. But here. When the sun came up, Frank said he should go, let them rest, be a family. William asked him to stay, just a little longer. Frank smiled, a real smile. The kind that transformed his face into something that looked exactly like William's joy. He stayed. Over the next few days, a routine formed. Frank would visit in the mornings, bring coffee and bagels, hold the baby while Vivian showered. Tell stories about William as a kid that made Vivian see her husband in a completely new light. He was gentle with the baby, respectful with Vivian, careful around William like he was afraid of breaking something fragile and new between them. Vivian asked Frank to tell her everything, not because she wanted to punish William, but because she needed to understand, needed to know what she was bringing into her daughter's life. Frank was honest, painfully honest, about the shoplifting charge when he was 19, the assault charge at 22 that came from a bar fight, the 2 years in county jail, the homelessness, the addiction he'd fought and beaten, the long road to clean. He didn't make excuses, didn't blame everything on William leaving, took ownership of his choices even as he acknowledged the circumstances that had shaped them. Vivian found herself respecting him for that, for his honesty, for the man he was trying to become. She asked William why he'd really called Frank that morning, why after 14 years of silence, he'd reached out in the middle of labor. William said he'd been standing in the hospital parking lot, watching rain pour down, thinking about becoming a father. And suddenly he couldn't do it. Couldn't become a parent while pretending he'd never had a family. Couldn't teach his daughter about love and connection while hiding the fact that he'd abandoned his own brother. He said it was the hardest phone call he'd ever made, harder than proposing, harder than calling to say they'd lost the first pregnancy. Because he had to admit who he really was, what he'd really done. He'd expected Frank to hang up, to curse him out, to refuse, but Frank had just asked what hospital, what time, and said he'd be there. Vivian asked Frank why he'd answered. After everything, after being left behind and forgotten, why show up for the brother who'd chosen a scholarship over family? Frank was quiet for a long time. Then he said because William had called, because despite everything, William had reached out. Because Frank had spent 14 years being angry and it hadn't made anything better. Because he was tired of being alone. The truth was messy, complicated. Not the neat narrative of villain and victim Vivian had first imagined. They were both just people, damaged people trying to survive trauma in the ways they knew how. William by running, Frank by fighting, both of them leaving pieces of themselves behind. On the day Vivian and the baby were discharged, William asked Frank if he wanted to come to the house, see the nursery, stay for dinner. Frank hesitated. Said he didn't want to intrude. Vivian surprised herself by saying he wouldn't be, that he was family, that their daughter deserved to know her uncle. The word uncle felt strange at first, then normal, then right. Frank followed them home in his beat-up truck. Vivian watched him in the rearview mirror. This man who looked exactly like her husband but wasn't. This man who'd suffered while they'd thrived. This man who was trying. He stood in the nursery doorway like he was afraid to enter. William showed him the crib he'd built, the mobile Vivian had picked out, the tiny clothes that seemed impossibly small. Frank touched a yellow onesie with careful fingers, said it was perfect, said their daughter was lucky. William said she'd be even luckier to know Frank. They ordered pizza because no one had the energy to cook. Sat around the living room with the baby sleeping between them, told stories, filled in gaps, started to learn each other again. Frank asked what they'd named her. Vivian looked at William. They'd had a name picked out for months, but suddenly it felt wrong, incomplete. She said they'd named her Emma Grace Johnson, but she wanted Frank to choose her middle name, to give her something from him. Frank's eyes went wide. He said he couldn't, that it was too much. William said it wasn't enough, but it was a start. Frank thought for a long time, then said, what about Hope? Emma Hope Johnson, because that's what she was. Hope that broken things could heal. Hope that lost people could be found. Hope that family wasn't just blood, but choice. Vivian felt tears in her eyes again. She said it was perfect. The weeks that followed weren't easy. There were hard conversations, arguments about the past, moments when old wounds reopened. Vivian had to rebuild trust with William, had to learn to forgive the lies even as she understood why he'd told them, had to make space in her life for Frank. For this unexpected uncle who was trying so hard to prove he deserved to be there. Frank came to dinner every Sunday, helped paint the fence, fixed the leaky sink William had been meaning to get to, brought gifts for Emma that were thoughtful and careful, a handmade wooden rattle, a book about twins, a savings bond for her college fund that he could barely afford but insisted on. He was building something. They all were. A family that looked nothing like what Vivian had imagined but felt more real because of it. Frank started therapy, talked about his past, his trauma, his choices. Worked on being the man he wanted to be instead of the man circumstances had made him. William did the same, went to therapy alone and then with Frank, learned to sit with his guilt without drowning in it, to acknowledge what he'd done without letting it define him, to be a better husband by being honest, to be a better father by showing Emma what it meant to own your mistakes and fix them. Vivian watched her daughter grow, watched her smile at both William and Frank, watched her reach for them with tiny hands that didn't know the difference between father and uncle, didn't know about the pain that had brought them all together, just knew love, just knew family. On Emma's first birthday, they had a party in the backyard. Frank was there early, helping hang decorations, William's arm around his shoulder in a photo that Vivian captured. Two identical men, different paths, same destination, together. Vivian thought about that morning in the delivery room, when two versions of her husband walked in and her world tilted on its axis. She'd thought it was the worst thing that could happen, the exposure of lies and secrets and pain. But standing there watching Frank blow bubbles while William held Emma, watching her daughter giggle at the two men who loved her most, Vivian realized something. Sometimes the worst thing and the best thing look exactly the same. Sometimes the moment that breaks you is the same moment that makes you whole. Sometimes family isn't about the secrets you keep, but the truth you're brave enough to tell. Emma Hope Johnson would grow up knowing her father had a twin, would hear the story of how her uncle came back, would learn that people are complicated, that families are messy, that love isn't about perfection, but about showing up anyway, about choosing connection over comfort, about rebuilding what's broken. Vivian looked at William, at Frank, at Emma, at the family that almost wasn't, the family that shouldn't have worked, the family that did. And she felt grateful, not for the lies, but for the truth that came after, not for the pain, but for the healing it made possible. Frank caught her looking, smiled that smile that was William's smile but also completely his own, asked if she was okay. Vivian nodded, said she was better than okay, said she was exactly where she was supposed to be, with exactly the people she was supposed to be with. And for the first time since two identical men walked into her delivery room and changed everything, Vivian believed it, believed in second chances, believed in forgiveness, believed in the strange, beautiful, complicated thing they were building together. Family, not despite the secrets, but because they'd survived them, together.